Operation Pied Piper is something I first heard about as a child. It's an incredible story from history. It really happened. But I got my first glimpse of it from a work of fiction. When I was a kid, I was reading C.S. Lewis's famous series, The Chronicles of Narnia, and in one of those stories, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there are 4 children who are siblings who arrive on a train at a big old house in the country, which is occupied by an elderly professor and his staff. And this professor is no relation of theirs, but they've been sent to stay with him in the countryside because of the air raids in London. Now, the rest of the story unfolds about the adventures that the children have in that house, and with a particular wardrobe in that house. And readers of the story will know exactly what I'm talking about. But this tantalizing hint, this frame story of these children fleeing London and their parents to live in a countryside with a stranger was something that stayed with me. And I went digging and uncovered the story of Operation Pied Piper, which is the one I want to share with you today. C.S. Lewis wasn't making up that part about children leaving London on trains to live with strangers. It was a much bigger story than I realized. This is that story. It's a story full of danger and sacrifice. It's a story full of service and heroism. And while Operation Pied Piper divides opinions, people are not necessarily in agreement about whether the actions that were taken were necessarily the right ones, it's a fascinating story nonetheless. You're listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, where we specialize in fascinating stories and gripping characters from history. And normally, I do a series of episodes on a subject. Today's episode is a one-off, at least that's what I think for the moment. But you can catch up on all the other stories and series on the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, so Spotify or Apple, or you can get the illustrated version on YouTube under Villains and Virgins. The year is 1940, and the month is May. Winston Churchill has just become Prime Minister of England. He succeeded Neville Chamberlain, the previous Prime Minister, who has become infamous to high school students everywhere for brokering the Munich Agreement with Adolf Hitler. Neville Chamberlain is the one who came back saying, "Peace for our time," after getting Hitler to sign a deal that he thought would avert another conflict. Adolf Hitler had recently annexed or swallowed up Austria and made it essentially a province of Germany. And after getting away with this, with relatively little protest from other countries in Europe, he then set his eyes on parts of Czechoslovakia, where there were German-speaking minorities living. And Hitler said that these parts of Czechoslovakia should be ceded to Germany. He had this idea that all German-speaking people who shared the same ethnic background and the same culture, should be united under the rule of the Third Reich. It was when Hitler decided to invade and take these parts of Czechoslovakia that other countries in Europe began to make unpleasant noises. England and France had signed agreements that made them essentially allies of Czechoslovakia. And so when Hitler invaded that country, they were obligated in some way to help with its defense. This was going to involve them in a European war, and there was very little appetite for that in England. Neville Chamberlain tried to calm the situation by finding loopholes in those agreements that did not obligate Britain and France to take up arms, and he then brokered a deal signed by Adolf Hitler that would allow Hitler to take those parts of Czechoslovakia, but nothing else. The Czech diplomats were not included in these discussions between Britain, France, and Germany. Nobody asked them what they thought of territories in their country being swallowed by Germany. And when Hitler signed the deal, the Czechs were essentially presented with a fait accompli. You can either take this deal, or you can fight the Germans, but if you do, you'll be alone. France and Britain would not be taking up arms to defend Czechoslovakia against German advances. And it was this agreement that Neville Chamberlain brought back triumphantly, with the feeling that he had, with this paper, averted a potentially expansive and very bloody war. Neville Chamberlain brought this deal back to England, declaring that it accomplished peace in our time. And that was something that a lot of people wanted to hear. Britain had suffered through World War I just over 20 years before, and it had cost them over 700,000 military fatalities and over 1 million total fatalities when we add the number of dead civilians to the number of soldiers. No one wanted to revisit that experience, and Chamberlain felt relieved to have saved his country from round 2 with the mechanized meat grinder that modern warfare had become. Sadly, he was incorrect. Winston Churchill, even before his appointment as Prime Minister, had been a lone voice in the English Parliament saying that Hitler's advances in Europe would not cease unless they were forcibly stopped. And these were words that nobody wanted to hear, but he had stood out on many occasions saying that German aggression was going to call for a very serious response. And when he finally became Prime Minister, the writing was already on the wall. His unpleasant prophecies were already coming to fruition. After swallowing Austria and invading Czechoslovakia, on August 31st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland and began tearing a bloody swath through that country. It was only days later, in September of 1939, that Britain and France would be forced to declare war on Germany. Winston Churchill had just inherited, only months later, in the spring of 1940, the leadership of a country that was about to face its darkest hour. Preparations for possible German hostilities against Britain had actually been quietly underway since the summer of 1938. The government had been forced to prepare for all contingencies, even the most unpleasant and dreaded ones. And so when war was finally officially declared in September 1939, life changed overnight for people in Britain, and the measures that were brought rapidly into place were ones that had been planned and carefully thought about well in advance. And life changed for everyone across society, men, women, and children. Suddenly, everyone was issued gas masks directly from the government, and children were required to carry these clumsy and terrifying-looking gas masks with them everywhere, including to school every single day. Everyone received instruction in how to use the gas masks in the event of a poison gas attack. And this was something that Britain feared Germany might launch at them now that war was officially declared. Authorities expected attack from the air, they expected bombings, and they also anticipated a potential land invasion. So there were all-out preparations across Britain, not just in the military, but amongst civilians as well, to try and respond to these awful possibilities. Air raid shelters were built across the country. There were many of them that were installed in urban areas, but also in suburban ones. If there was a house on its own lot, that needed to have its own air raid shelter, usually buried in the garden. There were air raid siren drills, so that everyone can become accustomed to the eerie and disturbing sound of these sirens that would begin to moan, indicating that death from above was imminent. And people were trained to run to the nearest shelter at the sound of these sirens. Initially, of course, these were just drills. The bombs hadn't yet begun, but preparation in England was thoroughly underway. It was in these circumstances that the remarkable story we're going to call Operation Pied Piper was put into action. The British government remembered that bombs that were dropped on London in World War I had killed about 500 people. And that wasn't really a sustained and thorough bombing campaign of the sort that they could now expect. The air power that Germany had by now developed made any of their previous incendiary campaigns from above look laughable by comparison. Government officials in Britain were convinced that the number of bombs likely to fall in a German campaign now would be in the tens of thousands, and that casualties that they could expect would rise to an alarming level. Accordingly, they made plans to evacuate as many people as possible from urban and manufacturing centers, leaving only the people who were most critical, the people who were working to keep those cities and those factories running, in place. And this meant, most of all, children were going to be evacuated in unprecedented numbers. Over the course of the entire operation, more than 3.5 million children were evacuated from urban centers across Britain. They were taken, of course, from the obvious targets, big cities like London, manufacturing centres like Manchester and Liverpool, but they were also taken out of other territories that the government deemed high risk, coastal areas where a land invasion might be most likely to show up. So children were being moved from areas where air raids were deemed to be most probable into safer, low-risk parts of the country where there were no obvious military targets. And it was hoped that this would spare children from being among the enormous casualties that were going to be inevitable. The evacuations were voluntary, but they were strongly urged. There were government posters, there was messaging on the radio, messages came out from local schools. In fact, children often came home with a letter that was issued to them at their local school, giving them directions about the date and time that they should report to that school with a small suitcase and the clothes they would need to travel out for an evacuation. Now, it affected children from poorer families to a much higher degree, because wealthier British families simply sent their children to stay with friends and family who already had houses in the country. So they had their own social connections and their own alternative properties that they could send their children to. And so children from those classes of society had a much easier transition. They went from one comfortable place to another, and they were often cared for by people that they had some existing social connection to. Of course, this wasn't possible for as many children as were going to be involved, over 3.5 million. So it was children from poor families, children from working class areas who are going to have to be evacuated and sent where? This government program involved calling on families in more rural areas who had an extra bed or some space to volunteer and billet some of these evacuated children. So again, there was very, very strong pressure that this was part of the war effort, and that mothers, for example, in the countryside who opened their homes to evacuated children were in the service too. This was their contribution to the war. It was very important, and there were local committees of volunteers who were in charge of assessing how much space and how many beds were available in a particular town, and ensuring that the families who had those spaces showed up at the local school when evacuated children arrived to collect some of them and take them into their homes. In addition to school-aged children, pregnant mothers and even younger siblings who were not yet school-aged were included in the evacuations. And typically, people would assemble at a school, and then they would be taken to a train. And at the height of the evacuation efforts, there were trains leaving every 9 minutes. Children were given a government-stamped postcard to mail back to their parents whenever they got to their billet, or the family that would be hosting them, because neither the parents, nor the children, nor the volunteers loading them onto the trains knew exactly where each child was going to end up. Operation Pied Piper proceeded in waves. 3.5 million children weren't moved overnight or in a couple of days. The first round of 350,000 children were moved out of London just days before war was officially declared with Germany. And between 1939 and 1944, that's when we see the grand total of evacuated children begin to mount. But it happened in fits and starts. It happened in response to increasing danger that was being felt in various centres around Britain. But strangely, the first 6 months after Britain declared war on Germany were eerily quiet. The rains of bombs that government planners had been fearing hadn't yet arrived. And this was largely because Germany had its attention occupied elsewhere. Germany was busy swallowing up the rest of Europe at this point. And so the full force of its attention and assault hadn't yet arrived over British skies. British troops, of course, were fighting the Germans. They were fighting in other parts of Europe, like Norway and eventually France. But because bombs weren't falling in British cities yet, the first wave of children who'd been evacuated began to drift home after about 6 months, because the children missed their parents and the parents missed the children, and the awful danger that had precipitated this this separation hadn't materialized yet. So by Christmas of 1939, on the eve of 1940, a lot of the children who had initially gone to the countryside had begun to trickle home. But it was only a few short months later, in May 1940, the very month that Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, that things were really going to heat up. That same month, Hitler launched a campaign to invade the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. And in 6 sickeningly short weeks, all 3 of those countries surrendered. In fact, this campaign came to an end with the famous Battle of Dunkirk, which you'll remember from your high school history classes, where French and British forces who had been fighting the Germans had to be evacuated off a beach in France, and evacuated by an amazing flotilla of every boat that could be found, including fishing boats. And while it was an amazing story that saved a large number of British and French soldiers' lives, it was nevertheless a story that took place at the end of an astonishing defeat. France, considered to have one of the strongest militaries in Europe, surrendered to Germany. And this left Britain basically alone. Her strongest and nearest ally had made terms with the Germans. Many other European countries were now under German rule, and Britain was left alone, without assistance, and knowing that she would be the next in the crosshairs for Germany's apparently inexorable advance. So Winston Churchill becomes Prime Minister in this very same month of May, just in time for a front row seat to this 6-week collapse of England's nearest and strongest ally. No one was expecting it to happen that fast. After all, in World War I, the French military had proved itself fully capable of taking on the German one, and they had fought each other for years. The French had had the training, the technology, and the fighting spirit to take the Germans on multiple fronts for a prolonged period of time. So what had changed? And how could it be possible that already France was flattened? Churchill could be certain of only one thing, that death and destruction were on their way to Britain, and his mission was to prepare his country to withstand that onslaught. Now, from the German perspective, it seemed a completely hopeless case. I mean, Adolf Hitler didn't at all think that he was going to need to invade Britain. He thought that they would very quickly come to see the logic of their position, that they could not win, that Germany had already defeated everything around them, and what point would there really be in losing more lives and in causing more destruction? He thought that Winston Churchill would just recognize that his position was impossible and would wisely sign a treaty with the Führer, allowing Hitler to move his attentions eastward toward Russia. But shockingly, Winston Churchill refused. He was prepared to take his country, all alone, Britain without any allies, and to set her up against a military that had just flattened most of Europe. Hitler was astonished, shocked. He actually sent several messages, and at one point made a comment to one of his aides along the lines of, "What more can I do? I can't exactly go to London on bended knee and sue for peace. I've been as forthcoming and as gracious as possible. How could they possibly want to persist with battle under these conditions? They can't do anything but lose." This is how it looked to Germany, and indeed how it might have looked to a lot of people. But Winston Churchill wasn't prepared to make terms. I think at this moment, we have to pause and appreciate the darkness of the situation in which this decision was made, and to ask ourselves the question, what if Winston Churchill had done the sensible thing? What if he had said, there is no point having thousands, hundreds of thousands of dead civilians in British cities. There's no point taking our young men and throwing them again into this storm of steel that the Germans have created, from which very few are going to emerge alive. Why? We're likely to lose. Maybe we should just make an agreement, like our neighbors in France have done, and call it a day. Unlike us, Winston Churchill didn't have the benefit of knowing how this story was going to unfold. For him, the possibility of destruction, death, and defeat was all too looming. In fact, it must have seemed a very slim chance indeed that defeat could be avoided. And yet, he was willing to take the odds, and he was willing to fight. It's an amazing decision, and it's fortunate for everyone that it turned out the way that he was gambling that it would. But we have to appreciate that so very easily it could have ended quite differently. Now, before I get into the spooling up of the German assault on Britain and their attempt to crush that country once and for all, I'm going to jump back and mention some of the preparations that are now happening for civilians in Britain in 1940. In addition to the evacuation of children from urban centers, there were some English parents who arranged for their children to be evacuated overseas. There was a program that reached even as far as America, where some famous American companies like Hoover vacuums and Kodak cameras agreed to sponsor or to host the children of their British employees. So British employees who were working for these countries' factories or businesses in Britain could send their children to America, and these companies would arrange billeting and caring for these evacuated children. In Britain, this program was called the Children's Overseas Reception Board, and it was dedicated to finding billets or host families for as many British children as possible. And these children went not just to America, but some also to Canada and Australia as well. Hundreds of children were moved under this program until a terrible event ended it abruptly. There were a number of parents in the city of Liverpool who arranged to send their children on a ship to Canada under the Overseas Reception Board program. And over 90 children boarded a ship called the City of Benares. Some of these children were traveling with their mothers, but many of them were traveling alone, and they were hoping that they would get far away from Britain, which would soon be in the thick of conflict, and into a place of safety in Canada. Only 4 days after the ship left harbor, it was torpedoed by a German submarine and sank, killing 265 people, including over 70 of the 90 children who had been on board. At this point, ships carrying children away from Britain to safer places stopped sailing. Nobody wanted a repeat of that, and further evacuations were done on land. Now, it's worth mentioning that this idea of evacuating children from war zones wasn't an exclusively British one. In fact, Germany evacuated a very large number of children from Berlin at about the same time, in 1940. It was a voluntary evacuation, so it wasn't required, but it had been arranged by the government and it was strongly encouraged. Families were urged to send their children out of harm's way on these transports that had been arranged. Over the course of the war that was about to gear up, British bombers would drop over 1,500 tons of explosives on German cities, including places like Berlin and Cologne. In one night, a fire started by a British bombing raid on the German city of Dresden wiped out 90% of the buildings in that city, and of course vaporized anybody who happened to be living in them. Allied raids on Germany over the course of the war killed approximately 600,000 civilians, leaving more than 13 million homeless. Just stop to imagine that for a second. 13 million people homeless, because the buildings that they lived in and everything they owned has been exploded by bombs. It's a horrifying human toll, and the cost for civilians of air raids that are going to unfold between Britain and Germany is something that is not spoken about as frequently as the military engagements, but is absolutely horrifying when you get into the details. Operation Pied Piper, which continued in Britain in fits and waves over the course of the war, was a massive logistical undertaking. It required more than 17,000 volunteers from the Women's Voluntary Service alone, in addition to volunteer time from teachers and railway personnel and other people who were involved in organizing, transporting, and keeping track of all these children who'd just been separated from their families. Winston Churchill's certainty that a horrible onslaught was about to begin was not misplaced. In fact, the Germans were making plans for a full-scale invasion of Britain. Operation Sea Lion was the name of this plan. It was going to involve the German Air Force, or Luftwaffe, and it was going to require a very large number of ships to transport German troops onto British shores. In preparation, the German military had collected over 2,400 barges of various kinds that were currently used for traffic on rivers, and was attempting to convert them into troop carriers and even carriers for tanks. So these preparations were happening. The idea that the Germans were coming, and they were coming in force, wasn't a paranoia that Churchill was entertaining by himself in Whitehall. It was something that was being very actively prepared for in the Reich. However, the planners of Operation Sea Lion knew that before landing German troops on British shores, it would be necessary for the German Air Force to crush the British RAF, the British Air Force. And so the first stage of this plan was going to be a devastating series of air raids or bombings that were going to be designed to wipe out the British RAF. So not only were they planning to shoot down these airplanes as they engaged them, but German bombers would be targeting airplane production facilities as well, so that more airplanes could not be manufactured or repaired, and that Britain's ability to defend its own skies would be crushed. The German Luftwaffe immediately began executing this plan. And from September 1940 to May 1941, they flew regular bombing raids over Britain in a period that has come to be known as the Blitz. The Luftwaffe initially attempted to just target British aircraft production facilities. Hitler was still hoping that after a few rounds of Luftwaffe visits, that Britain would come to its senses and make terms. But as September passed and that didn't happen, the Luftwaffe's mission expanded to crushing Britain's fighting spirit as a nation. And so their bombers were no longer restricted to aircraft production facilities, but then began targeting manufacturing centers like Manchester and Liverpool, and eventually London itself, making no distinction between civilian areas and parliament buildings and obvious military targets. This campaign killed 43,000 civilians in Britain and left over 1 million people homeless. There are stories of entire families sleeping in metro stations, subway stations where the subway trains come and go, and they would be sheltering down there not just for taking cover during air raids, but having emerged from that shelter when the air raid was over and finding that their entire apartment block had been demolished, they'd be sleeping there for many months after that because they had nowhere else to go. People died every night that bombers flew over Britain, and the grim remains of shattered buildings and dismembered bodies would be on full display when the sun came up. This became a regular occurrence. This campaign of terror was conducted with the idea of either breaking Britain's spirit enough that the civilians themselves would demand their Prime Minister sue for peace, or failing that, to wipe out Britain's air defenses so that under Operation Sea Lion, German troops could roll up to British beaches and finish the job. I'm going to read you an eyewitness account from the British city of Norwich. This is someone who was a child during the time of air raids and is recollecting what the experience was like to live through that. This eyewitness account was posted on a BBC archive and is available online. When we reached the back door, we were stunned to see the whole garden lit up by aircraft flares. And before we could move, the German aircraft began diving on the city. The noise was tremendous. The roar of engines, the whistle of the bombs, and the huge bang as they exploded. We all stood there paralyzed, until in a gap, Father shouted out for us to run now, and we sprinted the 50 feet to the shelter, closely followed by our next-door neighbors. The noise was now unbelievable, and the ground shook, especially when a large landmine was dropped onto Eaton Park. At intervals, Father would vanish up to the top to check if our house was still standing, while we stayed below in a stunned silence at what was the worst ever attack we had known, and our city had virtually no defense. After 2 hours, it was all over, and we came out of the shelter. Mother, being in the Red Cross, went immediately to her duty point in the local rest center, while my father and I walked down to the police box at the junction of Coleman and Unthank Road to talk with the policeman on duty, and we learned that the news was bad. Later, we heard that over 50 tons of bombs had been dropped, with 162 people killed and over 600 injured. I was convinced that no one would go to school the next day, so before breakfast on the Tuesday, 2 of us went to Eaton Park to see if we could collect some bomb splinter souvenirs. We climbed down the massive crater of the mine and also walked over several small holes, collecting some good souvenirs. On our way back, we were surprised to find the park gates were now locked and guarded by a soldier. He was amazed to see us in the park and shattered us by saying that the park was closed due to unexploded bombs. They were the small holes we had walked over. You get a sense of the terror and the helplessness that so many British civilians would have felt. In this account, we hear that their city had no defense, and that was largely true because the German Luftwaffe began to come only at night. And they did this because the British RAF was unable to effectively engage them at night. They didn't have the technology to be able to see and locate the enemy adequately. And so when the German bombers came at night, they were largely undisrupted. And that left civilians and their cities completely helpless and vulnerable to these bombs. And you also have a sense of the fact that bombing had become so commonplace that the idea of going and collecting souvenirs, especially hot shrapnel, which is something that comes up in other eyewitness accounts, was a very common thing for children who had not been evacuated to do in bombed urban centers. As the Blitz continued month after month, the damage piled up. On December 19th, 1940, a bombing raid on London lit a fire that destroyed so many buildings that it has become known as the Second Great Fire of London. The last time London had seen so many buildings destroyed by fire was the First Great Fire of London in 1666. So the damage caused by these bombers in 1940 was truly incredible. In May 1941, 541 German bombers flew over London, deliberately targeting Parliament, St. James's Palace, and the British Museum. And this was a deliberate attempt to inflict so much damage on these buildings that were national symbols and landmarks that the British people would surely sue for surrender. Defeat was inevitable, Hitler thought. The damage was piling up. Why would these stubborn English not come to terms and avoid more suffering? However, Britain would not give up. Winston Churchill was convinced that if Britain could just hold out long enough, they could receive economic and eventually military aid from the United States. And if that happened, Hitler could be defeated. But of course, this wasn't a guarantee. Churchill was gambling that he could make the right case that would draw America into the war and see that the defense of Britain was necessary to the defense of the free world. There was very little appetite in America to get involved in what was seen as a European conflict, and it was by no means straightforward that America would agree even to financial aid, let alone military aid. But those were the odds that Churchill was counting on. And in that uncertainty between the time that the German bombers started destroying Britain and the time that there was a promise of aid from America, he had to galvanize his countrymen to resist the sickening number of casualties and injuries and the rising rate of homelessness that was being inflicted on people night after night. His ability to sustain the fighting spirit of his countrymen cannot be minimized as a factor for why Britain survived the war. And I'm going to give you a taste of his ability to inspire right now. Winston Churchill was famous for his speeches that he would give in the House of Commons or in Parliament, and speeches that he would make to his countrymen over the radio, as well as the words that he often communicated to them in person. Because one of the habits he had was to go around in a car and visit personally cities and areas that had been severely bombed. And without any sort of fanfare or entourage, people would turn around from cleaning up the rubble and digging out their things to find their prime minister standing there surveying the ruins and letting them know that he was fully aware of their suffering, that he wasn't hiding away in Whitehall or in a planning room somewhere, but that he was acutely aware of the human cost that ordinary British people were paying to withstand the German assault. In a speech to the House of Commons in 1940, Winston Churchill said, and I quote, Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, and all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more prolonged by the lights of a perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty, and so bear ourselves that if the British Commonwealth and Empire lasts for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. There's a bit of the Shakespearean there, don't you think? A little bit of Henry V's speech at Agincourt in Shakespeare's famous reimagining of it. This was perhaps Churchill's superpower, the ability to use words to stir the spirits of his countrymen and to reference their history, their traditions, their identity, and everything that they held dear. Because this was a fight for all of those things, and he was going to make sure that everybody understood that. Britain's resistance to the German attack was total. It involved everybody in the country. Now, of course, it began with young men, ages 20 to 23, who were immediately conscripted for service in the armed forces. But by 1941, young women between the ages of 20 and 30 were also conscripted to working in places like factories and munitions manufacture so that they were serving the war effort as well. There were also countrywide voluntary organizations, including the Red Cross, which we heard from our eyewitness account. The mother in that family immediately went to her post as a Red Cross worker. There were committees of people whose sole job was to direct their fellow countrymen during an air raid. They would be out there whenever an air raid was happening to get people into shelters, and also to provide medical assistance and rescue to those people who were trapped or injured by the bombs. And these people did shifts night after night. Nobody paid them to do it. Everybody had a role to play, and people did this cheerfully, and they did it persistently. And then there were the public placards and announcements that let people know how they could contribute to the war effort in their daily lives, when they were doing things on their off time. So famously, there were posters urging people to make do and mend. In other words, not to go shopping for new things because there weren't many new things to be had. And that was because British shipping was constantly under attack by German submarines. So a lot of the supplies that were needed, things like new shoes and clothing and housewares, were sinking. They weren't reaching the country. And so if you had something that was broken, you couldn't just go and buy another one. You had to find a way to make it work and to get by with less. Fabric that could be used to manufacture clothes was in short supply, and things like fresh or tinned fruit suddenly disappeared. Anything that wasn't grown in Britain was suddenly very, very hard to come by. And then there were the water conservation messages. Notably, these messages that urged everyday people to use less water and to run a bath for yourself and then share it with a friend. It didn't mean that you and your friend had to be in the bath at the same time. It meant that you would run one bath, the first person would get into it and clean themselves off, and then they would leave the bath water for the second person to use. Now, this of course wouldn't be a popular measure, and it required leadership from the very top. Famously, the king was filmed inspecting a 5-inch water level in his bath, showing that even at the highest levels, no one was exempt from the call to use as little water as possible, no more than was required, even if you were the King of England. Churchill and his advisors kept their eyes locked on the weather forecasts. Bright moonlit nights would almost certainly bring bombers. But if there were an extended period of good weather, that could form the conditions that would bring a German invasion force across the water and onto British beaches. Everyone in Britain who owned a car was given instructions on how to rapidly make it unserviceable so that an invading force couldn't grab that vehicle and use it for their own purposes. Civilian men worked in teams to set up traps and barriers along British beaches to make it very difficult for a landing force to make progress. These might be large cement blocks that were staggered to prevent tanks from being able to roll up the beach and onto firmer ground. But sometimes barbed wire and mines were added as well, which could pose a danger to unwary civilians who might happen to wander along a beach that had been so prepared. Local defense leagues were also established, and these were composed of civilian men who were organized and dedicated to defending their area, their neighborhood, their line of coast in the event that an invasion force arrived. Everybody was thinking about this all the time. It invaded every part of daily life for people who lived in Britain during these years. Food rations were one of the wartime measures that hit ordinary people early, hit them hard, and wore them down because they continued for months into years. Now, a ration meant that you couldn't just go to the store and buy a dozen eggs because there were a dozen eggs to be had. It meant that as an individual or as a family, there was a certain amount of eggs or flour or sugar that you could buy in a week, and no more. Even if you had more money, you were not allowed to buy more of those particular foods. And that's because the government had to make sure there'd be enough food to go around for everybody, not just the civilian populations, but also the military ones. And the usual supply of food was under attack. The ships that normally brought food and meat and fabric and all these things were sinking with terrifying regularity. And so the supply was diminishing, and therefore everyone's use of these materials had to be strictly regulated. So how this was done was individual families were issued with a ration book, and it would have a certain number of coupons or points that they could spend every week. Different foods would have a certain number of points assigned to them. So let's imagine that eggs are 5 points each, a bag of flour might be 15, and so on. I'm making these numbers up. I don't know exactly how many points an egg versus the flour was in 1941, but they would be given these points depending on their value and their scarcity. If you had a budget of, say, 40 points to spend that week, you could spend it all on eggs if you wanted to, but that meant you couldn't buy anything else, even if you had money. You'd used up the number of ration points that you'd been allocated, and that was it. So families would try to find ways to go for lower point items so that they could stretch their rations and fill people's bellies to have enough food to eat without running short of their allotted amounts. Everyday items like meat, butter, and sugar were very strictly limited. There's nobody surviving on a keto diet in Britain in 1941, guaranteed. You'd be lucky if you got meat, and if you did, you'd be getting cheap cuts, small amounts, and you'd do everything you could to spread that out. There wasn't much meat to go around. The 2-ounce ration of tea per person that was introduced in the Christmas of 1941 was particularly hard for people to take because the one thing that was turned to regularly for comfort by people across Britain was tea, and they would drink cups upon cups upon cups of it every day. So when people were limited to 2 ounces per person, suddenly there were stories of families taking the tea leaves they'd used and spreading them out to dry them out so that they could reuse the leaves as many times as possible, and drinking cups of tea that resembled pale urine in color. There wasn't much tea there. There wasn't much tea to go around. Of course, things like cheese and sweets were vanishingly rare. And there's a story of Mrs. Churchill, the Prime Minister's wife, being unreasonably delighted by a bag of oranges that a visiting American diplomat had tucked into his bags as he left the United States and flew across to Britain. Oranges hadn't been seen for as long as anyone could remember, and this treat of fresh fruit was suddenly an incredible luxury, even for the Prime Minister's wife. Even items like shoes were extremely hard to come by. Pamela Hobbs, who was a child in Britain during this time, has written a book called Don't Forget to Write, the true story of an evacuee. And in this book, she tells a story about her mother queuing for hours when she received word that a local store had gotten a shipment of shoes, finally. So there were shoes to be had for the first day in who knows how long, and the line outside that store went on for hours. So this poor mother waits there patiently, hour after hour, and when it's finally her turn to get to the door of the store, the employee tells her there's only one pair of shoes left. And it happens to be not even her size. The shoes were too big. And she bought them anyway and took them home and stuffed the toes with newspaper because the ones that she had were falling apart. They had been so far past the point of repair that even buying a pair of shoes in the wrong size was going to be far better than the situation she found herself in. And of course, there were the blackout requirements. Because German bombers would be flying over Britain at night, any light that was leaking out of windows or that could be tracked moving along the streets could alert those bombers to the presence of a city, an urban center, and therefore make the source of that light a target. So blackout requirements extended to everybody. Every single house was required to put up thick pieces of cardboard or something to block out the light entirely from their houses so that nothing leaked. And there are many stories of, a family that might have put their light shield up and not tucked it all the way into the side so that light leaked out. And there were local wardens in every village, in every urban center, who would be patrolling the streets at night to ensure they were black, to ensure they were safe. And if they saw light leaking out of your house, they'd be at the door within a couple of minutes, demanding that you put that out immediately. Because failure to do it wouldn't just put the house in question in danger. It could mean death for hundreds of people in your community. So it radically changed the way people lived, from what they ate to where they shopped, to what they put on their bodies and how they spent their time. They had to modify their back gardens for shelters. They had to block the lights out. It was completely pervasive. And it wasn't just the houses that couldn't have lights. You couldn't have street lights on the roads. You couldn't have lights on vehicles that were driving. You couldn't even have white lines painted on curbs. And so in all these areas, lights were dimmed to the lowest possible setting that they could. So what do you think happened? If you were walking around in the dark and there were no street lights and there were no headlights and there were no lights coming out of windows, yes, there were a large number of car crashes and accidents as cars ran into people who were walking and people stumbled over curbs and people running into each other in the dark. But it was a smaller price to pay than a bombing raid. The evacuation of children across Britain continued, and as you'd expect, it picked up as the bombs started to fall. There was another large wave of children moved in June of 1940, and another huge wave in 1944 as well. In most of these cases, children were told to report to school with their bags packed on a weekend, and you'd have stories of parents walking their children up to the school. Often older siblings were put in charge of younger ones who might not even be school age, and they were strictly admonished by their parents to keep hold of little Bobby's hand and make sure you don't get separated from him no matter what. And it must have been absolutely gut-wrenching for parents to put their children, some as young as 7 and 4, onto a train into the hands of strangers to be sent nobody knew where exactly, but one hoped it would be a safer place. And of course, this was a lot of responsibility for young children. For a 7-year-old to be in charge of her 3-year-old brother for hours at a time as they journeyed far away from home and everything that they knew, it didn't always work out exactly. There's a story of a young girl who lost track of her 3-year-old brother on the course of the train journey out of her home and into the countryside. Typically, the trains would stop at some point for lunch, and the children would disembark, and they'd be served food that had been arranged for them by the evacuation committee. And so it was likely at this juncture that she let go of her little brother's hand to possibly grab a sandwich, and when the time came to reboard the train, her 3-year-old brother was not with her. He was later discovered 3 weeks later in the care of some local nuns. But one can only imagine the terror that this girl must have felt at the thought that she'd lost her baby brother, and possibly the 3-year-old as well, not only being separated from his parents, but from the sole remaining person that he recognized. And so children are sent into the hands of strangers, and in that case, they were reunited, but it must have been an absolutely nerve-wracking experience. Many parents wept as their children got on the trains and went out of sight. I mean, they might have been able to put a brave face on it as they walked their children to the school, but as they vanished from sight, The fear and the uncertainty of not knowing if or when they would see their children again was overwhelming. And yet they had to stay in the cities. Able-bodied people were absolutely vital to keeping Britain on her feet. And it wasn't just working in factories and munitions plants, but it was the sheer number of volunteers who were needed to do things like manning anti-aircraft guns from Hyde Park to shoot at bombers that were flying overhead, or working in a voluntary auxiliary fire brigade, so that if there was an air raid on your city and you were part of one of these groups, you'd be running out fighting fires to try and minimize the number of buildings that would be destroyed in these events. So, gut-wrenching as it was, there was nothing for it. The adults had to stay behind, and the children were hopefully going to somewhere safer. Now, when the evacuated children finally got to the countryside, they would be taken to the local school. And there they'd be lined up along the wall, and local families were brought in to inspect these evacuated children. And it was sort of like, according to eyewitness accounts that I've read, the way children pick each other for teams. That was the feeling. Nobody wants to be the last one chosen. And yet these children who were separated from their families would be lined up against a wall, and families would look them over like so many oranges and decide which one looked good and which one they wanted to take home. Now, taking in evacuated children was not something that local families were always thrilled to do. But there was very strong government pressure encouraging people to do it. And there were local committees designed to identifying which families had space and insisting that those families do their part and take in an evacuated child. Also, food was not as scarce in the countryside because people mostly lived off the land, so they weren't as severely affected by the shipping shortages of food materials that people in the cities so strongly relied on. So for some of the children who were living in the countryside, there was now more food available than they would have had at home. One child evacuee reports that her experience living in the countryside made her feel guilty because she was eating so much better than she knew her parents and older siblings were at home. But the experiences of evacuated children were definitely mixed. Some were cared for and loved as though they were the children that couple had never had, and they were welcomed into homes, and they were given a lot of attention and a lot of care. And in many cases, some of these evacuated children and their new families corresponded even years after the war was over. In other cases, a correspondence might have started between the new foster family of an evacuated child and the child's existing parents back in the city. So there was some contact that would happen. But other children were distinctly aware of their status as unwanted guests, as children who had been taken on sufferance, children that no one really wanted to have in the home, but the family had been obliged or pressured to take in, and these children had a very different experience. They suffered from neglect, sometimes from hunger. There are accounts of children who suffered both physical and sexual abuse at the hands of other older children in the home that they were in, or adults who saw their vulnerability and decided to take advantage of it. Because in cases of abuse, there were very few opportunities for a child to find someone safe to report it to. And there was an account from Pamela Hobbs's book of being an evacuee in this situation of a girl who was being abused by the brother of a woman she was staying with. And when she gathered the nerve to mention it to one of the teachers who had overseen the evacuation, there was such outrage in the village that someone there had been accused of this act that the evacuated children were loaded on a bus, all of them, and moved out of that community, and villagers threw rocks at the bus. So angry were they to have been tarred by this accusation. So you can only imagine the number of children who didn't speak out, given that kind of a possible reaction, and who suffered in unspeakable ways as they were separated from everything that was safe and everything that they knew. And other children were bounced around and had the instability of not knowing when they'd be moving and who they'd be seeing next. There is one evacuee who reports being in 4 different families before she was finally reunited with her parents. And it's hard to imagine how deeply unsettling and terrifying this would be for a child in their developing years, maybe a 5-year-old, a 7-year-old, to be separated from the people who all their lives have cared for them, and to attach to strangers only to be torn up from another home and moved again and again. Of course, we have parallels for this. We know children in the foster care system in our countries today, and the instability and the moving around is always associated with problems, with behavioral issues, with fear and insecurity. And this was an experience that some evacuated children certainly had. And some of the children were extremely young, under the age of 4, when they were taken from their parents and put into the hands of strangers. And who could adequately explain to a child that small why it was that they could never see mother again? The amount of grief and depression that some of these small children experienced was clear to observers at the time. Some of the children carried this trauma of abuse or separation into their adult lives. Some suffered the fear of abandonment and the lack of confidence in their relationships, not knowing when these things could be suddenly uprooted and ended. Years later, studies done by some psychologists concluded that the trauma suffered by children who'd been separated by their families during Operation Pied Piper was greater than the damage they would have suffered had they stayed with their families in cities under attack. Of course, this judgment is based on how things actually did turn out, and not how they could have turned out. And the government officials in charge of Operation Pied Piper had to plan for how things could have been. It's easy to pass judgment on the officials who designed Operation Pied Piper, but it's difficult to appreciate just how dire the situation looked to them at the time. Britain was looking into the face of possible annihilation. The very real possibility that the country would cease to be independent and free, and that its cities would be rolled over by German tanks and armed forces was a very real one. And so putting children into a place where they wouldn't have to be in the middle of a potential war zone during an invasion was something that seemed a lot saner at the time than it might seem to us today. To move children to a place where they wouldn't be literally in the crossfire of guns, where they wouldn't have to witness other members of their family die in front of them, and where they might survive and be cared for even if everyone they knew were wiped out. These were the sorts of things that planners at the time were weighing when they made this decision to move so many children so far from home. We have the benefit of hindsight, and we know that Britain would survive, bloodied but intact. The Blitz would eventually end. It wasn't going to be followed by Operation Sea Lion, with German panzer tanks rolling through the streets of London. Instead of that, Hitler would turn his attention to Operation Barbarossa and decide to fight with Russia. Winston Churchill had no such assurance, and all of these possibilities had to be weighed by his government when they made the massive undertaking to move so many children so far from home. The other aspect of this story that fascinates me is the intense level of determination and national spirit that the people of Britain demonstrated during their darkest hour. The sense of being in a fight for their very survival unified people as never before and allowed them to communally endure months and years of deprivation, being worn down by the little things, like not having tea or shoes without holes, and the big things, like having their houses bombed, their neighbors burst into bits, and their children separated from them for an unknown length of time. It allowed them to persevere and to give selflessly to help each other withstand this incredible trial. The number of hours that people spent digging others out of the rubble, fighting fires, working with the Red Cross, volunteering their time to contribute to the cause. The idea of everyone doing their bit really was a nationwide call, and it was answered by so many. The resilience that enabled the British people to keep going when the odds seemed overwhelmingly stacked against them was astonishing. Had they capitulated to the Germans in those dark months of 1940, when Britain stood alone, awaiting an invasion, with no certain help, history would have been very different. You've been listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and if you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with someone else that you think would find it enjoyable. Please make sure that you subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any future episodes of fascinating stories from history. You can subscribe on Apple, on Spotify, or on my YouTube channel if you prefer the illustrated version. Until next time.